Hey everyone, this is Max at MaxCTCG. Thank you for joining me in another video. What I'm going to be doing in this video is just breaking down the summary of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Basics guide that I made. So the reason why I made this is because I do feel like it can be pretty hard for newer players to get into the game. Not necessarily due to complexity, even though Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be a pretty complex game, especially at the highest levels, but more due to the amount of information it takes just to get into the game. It can be very overwhelming to players. And even the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Is structured today, for being able to, buy a starter deck or a structure deck and to get into the game, sometimes that could still feel overwhelming. At least that's my opinion on it, for trying to help new players get into the game. So what I wanted to do is to be able to try to help bridge the gap for new players that want to get into the game and potentially move to a more competitive thinking. I'm going to make a series of guides that help someone go from knowing nothing about the game to understanding the basics, to all of the key components to being able to compete at a competitive level, with the goal being at the end of the entire series that you'll be able to go compete in a local tournament, not necessarily win the tournament on your first try, but be able to go to the tournament and understand the thinking, what's being played, so that way when you go, you don't feel overwhelmed. And there's plenty of new players that get into the game. They buy a structure deck, which is a great starting point. They go to a tournament and they feel completely alienated by the whole process. They go to think they're going to have a good game, that they can compete, and they can't. A lot of times the games can feel so one-sided that that's the last time they play. And I think that's really bad for our game, and doesn't help with new players trying to get into it. I want them to feel prepared, so even if they don't necessarily do great, they'll feel like they kind of have somewhat of a handle of what's going on. So what we have here is just our Yu-Gi-Oh! Basics guide. This is the starting point. This is what I think you need to be able to have to kind of just get started with playing the game. We're going to be focused on what's kind of called old school Yu-Gi-Oh! It's the idea of what Yu-Gi-Oh! Was when it more first came out. A much simpler setup and kind of like learning point. But that way you can see if you even like the game first before we try to cram all this information in. So to get started, we'll kind of go through the guide and just kind of break down what the different components are. One thing I really want to do with this guide is, one, try to make it clear to understand information, having a good amount of visuals to help explain things, but also be able to include more modern competitive thinking when actually explaining the game, even from a simpler standpoint. Alright, so the first part is just getting started. So this is where we have our, what is Yu-Gi-Oh! And understanding like sample duel summary, like just the idea of what a duel kind of about, what are the different types of cards in the game, and what is the game mat, so what is it going to look like for where your cards go, how to activate them, all the different zones, things like that. Next we have the how to play section. So here you're going to learn about the different types of cards, but in a more broken down sense. So we'll start with the monster cards. You'll be able to understand how to read the card, what's the card anatomy, what's information on the card. Then we'll go through all the different summoning mechanics, at least the basic ones. There will be a point where we discuss more advanced ones that will be covered in Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Rulebook, or in Konami's Rulebook, whichever one you want to look at. And then we'll move on to how to read spell and trap cards, and then how to use spell and trap cards. So those are all the main cards in the game. We'll kind of go over the basics of understanding those. From there, we'll kind of go into beginning the dueling process. Do you understand what are the different methods for winning in a game? How to prepare for a duel, so you know what to do when you and your opponent sit down. And actually go through the process, that way you know what to do before the duel starts. How do you know who gets to go first or second? What are the ways to determine that? What should you do with your deck? How should you shuffle your opponent's deck? Things like that. And then we'll also cover the turn structure. So what does a turn look like in a game? We'll have a breakdown of that and explain some thinking behind how to think about your turn when you go first or second, because that can change what your goal is. Okay, and then from here we have a duel scenario. This is something I think that's really important for adding a little bit extra into this, giving you a stronger foundation. So we have important cards. This is the idea of introducing a meta, understanding what cards are important. That way you can actually think about how to play around those cards. Very important part of modern competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! But you could even use this thinking when playing for fun with your friends, to give yourself an edge to try to win more. Then we'll also have a mock duel setup. So here we're going to go through 2 turns of a mock duel with 2 of our most important characters in the anime, Yugioh and Seto Kaiba. What we'll do is they're going to actually do a duel that's going to be visually demonstrated out and walked through in writing, so that way you can understand the application of all the rules we've gone through and how the cards work in an actual duel. Then be able to also see the thought process behind why they're making the plays they're making, and then see how do these plays actually end up playing out based off what they thought. I think this will be one of the best parts, hopefully, of the guide, with kind of adding more competitive modern thinking to a simpler older format. And then from here, we'll go to the next section, which is moving forward. We'll kind of go an overview of the mock duel, kind of breaking down some components of it, what questions to think about asking yourself when you're in your own duels moving forward, to understand how I broke down thinking about the mock duel. Next we'll go why I think this process is better for newer people getting into Yu-Gi-Oh, because there could be some debate on what isn't the best move. Then we'll go over some older deck building examples. So I'll include what the deck list that's used in the mock duel, and then I'll also include some ideas for helping with older school deck building, because older school deck building's theory is different than more modern deck building theory. Just some basic rules in case you can't use all the cards that we're using in the mock duel, have an exact deck. Give you some ideas to try to help make your deck more consistent and try to keep the decks even, so when you play with your friends to practice, it feels like a game where either person can win based off, for the most part, skill, and not that one person has a big advantage because the decks are very. And then we'll also include a YDK file and where you can actually play. So there's a lot of different resources that you can play online. So YDK file is a file that you can import to get the deck from the mock duel, use exactly. Online, there's different services that you can look at for third-party simulators. They're all free to be able to play, and they give you access to all the cards in the game, and you can be able to use that to play against your friends, even if they don't live next to you, to be able to practice with pretty much anyone and kind of get a feel for the game. This is great for practicing even once you get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, so that way you can test out cards, see what you like, where you actually spend real money, and even test out cards that are out in Japan that aren't out here, so you know what to do before they even are released for the TCG. So that just kind of breaks down the summary of what the guide's going to go through and what the goal is. In the next video, we'll actually jump into the getting started part and just kind of learn the basic fundamental rules of the game and how to think about Yu-Gi-Oh from a big picture perspective. I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.